Okay.
And we're going to go live now.
Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to another Art Escapes, which are the virtual tours through Asia. Today, we will be enjoying the Art of the Himalayas with Dr. Jeff Durham. Today is June 5th, and we are so happy that you could join us today. So today's program, we're going to do the greeting and introduction. We're going to have the Art of the Himalayas video. And then after, if you're familiar with our program, we'll be doing the Q&A portion with our curator, Dr. Jeff Durham, who is the Associate Curator of Himalayan Art. And there's a little picture of our galleries. If you've been to our museum, you'll recognize it. That's on the 3rd floor. It's part of our wonderful collection. And we're so happy that we can highlight this collection this evening. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the Asian Art Museum sits on the San Francisco Peninsula and is located within the unceded territories of the Ohlone peoples, the Ramaytush, and the coastal Miwok. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to them as we live, work, and learn on their traditional homeland. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Indigenous peoples, past and present. So you guys might be familiar with Zoom controls, but if you're not, if you're new to webinars, there are 2 different functions that we'll mostly be using today. We have the chat function, and that is where you're able to communicate with the hosts and the panelists, myself included. And if you have any questions that you would like to direct to us, or if you would like to talk to people within the webinar, you'll be using the chat function. The Q&A is where we'll have you put your questions that you would like to ask the curator. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A throughout the program. You don't have to wait until the end of the video. You can, if you feel inspired to ask something, you can put that in as early as you want, and we'll be monitoring that. And that's how you'll be able to ask the curator questions. We can start with a little bit of practice. If you'd like to put in the chat, if you could travel in time, what would you want to see? We thought that was kind of a fun question. And if you'd like to drop an answer in the chat, we'd love to know what you would like to see if you could travel in time. And our hours of operation are Thursdays from 1 to 8 p.m. So we hope if you get a chance that you would be able to join us at the museum. We're also open Fridays through Mondays from 10 a.m. until 5 p.m. We're closed on Tuesdays and Wednesdays to give the art a little bit of a rest. And we have the free general admission days on the first Sunday of each month. Tomorrow is actually our next first free Sunday. So if you're in the area, we hope you'll drop by. If you're interested, membership levels, they start at $89. You get some special perks with that, such as invitations to member preview days and ticket pre-sales. There's also access to the virtual member lounge, discounts for parking at the cafe and our boutique, and the best benefit of all, free admission to both of our collections and special exhibition galleries. And let's see what we have in the chat. Oh, some people want to see 1920s California. The building of St. Chapel in Paris. Oh, that sounds amazing. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, amazing. Broadway shows from the 50s, that would be a lot of fun, definitely a nice experience. Oh, Cleopatra, that would be amazing. Oh, we've got dinosaurs. I would be very scared to probably see dinosaurs in person, but maybe from a bit of a distance. Kathleen says that she would like to meet the Indigenous peoples who lived where their street is on Oakland. I also am from Oakland, and I think that would be an amazing experience. It would be amazing to get to meet the people that were here before us. That definitely, oh, that's a really great answer. Okay. And if you're wondering what's new at the Asian Art Museum, here is one of our current and most recent installations. We have My House, My Tomb, which is resembling a pair of delicate chandeliers dangling from the ceiling. It's a sculptural piece, which is sort of drawn with industrial materials, including chains and fiberglass. And the primary medium of this piece is light. And so this is one of the installations that we're most excited about. It's the most recent installation at our museum. And we hope that if it's a free day or with a membership, you would get a chance to come see it. And so I've been talking a lot about the museum, and so I might as well talk a little bit about myself. My name is actually Sarah. It says Nicole Smith there. That's a bit of a typo. So my name's Sarah. I'm the supervisor of guest experience and group sales, although Nicole is someone I work with and respect very much. So I would be happy to, I'm happy to work with her, and might as well take that. I work on ticket sales. I work with the information desk and concierge station. Nicole and I both work in private tours and group visits. And you'll see me running around helping other departments, sort of helping with visitor flow and doing a lot of accessibility resources and things like that. And now the guest of honor, we have Dr. Jeffrey Durham. He's the Associate Curator of Himalayan Art. He's been with us for a while. Some of the exhibitions include Enter the Mandala, Divine Bodies, A Guided Tour of Hell, and Awaken, a Tibetan Buddhist journey towards enlightenment, currently at the Rubin Museum in Manhattan. He was previously the professor of religion at St. Thomas Aquinas College in the University of North Carolina. His research focuses on paintings from the Tibetan treasure tradition of the Nyingma order. And now we're going to have our curator on screen and introduce his video, and then we will be able to have our Q&A session.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Durham. As Sarah said, I'm the Associate Curator of Himalayan Art at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. And since we can't all of us, let's see, 102 of us, get into the gallery today, what we're going to do instead is we've recorded a tour focused on some of the most interesting objects in the gallery. I will be leading you through some of those objects. And while you are listening to the video and looking at some of these, please think about the things that are most interesting to you and that you might like to explore in the Q&A. Other than that, let's have some fun.
Hello, I'm Jeff Durham, the Associate Curator of Himalayan Art here at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. I am in the Himalayan galleries here at the museum, and I want to thank you for joining me for an exploration of some of the most interesting ideas, people, and objects in this gallery. I'd like to tell you about some of the great masters who brought Buddhism to Tibet. I'd also like to tell you a little bit about some of their teachings, as well as some magnificent cooperative ventures that arose between Tibetan lamas on the one hand and Chinese emperors on the other. So I hope you'll enjoy this exploration today. Thank you very much for coming. One of the things that I love most about the Himalayan Gallery is how every one of the objects in here is just packed full of stories. And perhaps the most interesting and maybe even the most important of all of these objects you see right here. This is a gentleman named Padmasambhava, whose name translates as the lotus-born one. In Tibetan, he's also known as Guru Rinpoche, the master of compassion. He is very important, for it was this gentleman who in the 8th century transmitted Buddhism across the Himalayas from India into Tibet. Now, if you take a look at him, you will notice very quickly that he is not your standard-looking monk. In fact, you see no monastic robe on him at all. Every detail of Padmasambhava is deeply loaded with symbolism. At the most basic level, take a look at the implement that he has in his right hand. That's called a vajra, and it's a symbolic thunderbolt. The implement in his left hand is a skull cup, and within that skull cup are all human negative emotions: desire, hatred, and delusion. What's he going to do? He's going to take that vajra, smash it into those negative emotions, and transform them into the nectar of immortality. And that's the essence of the Vajrayana path. So here are Padmasambhava's fundamental meditation instructions. Do not follow the past. Do not anticipate the future. Remain in the present moment, and don't mess with your mind. If you do that, you're going to find yourself radically present, and in Tibetan Buddhist thought, this is understood to be very close to the state of enlightenment. That hat he's wearing is a sorcerer's hat. And it's real good that Padmasambhava is a sorcerer, because it was only through the intervention of his sorcery that Tibet was able to receive the teachings of Buddhism. Now, unfortunately, Padmasambhava foresaw that in about 100 years, Buddhism would go into decline in Tibet. So he hid his teachings all across the Himalayas so that they would be rediscovered by just the right people at just the right time, which was around the year 1000, when Buddhism was reintroduced into Tibet in a second wave called the Sarma. After Padmasambhava's decease, a king named Langdharma decided that Buddhism was not right for him or for Tibet, and Buddhist monasteries were closed, Buddhist teachings were persecuted, and the tradition began to decline a great deal. In the year 1000, a king of Western Tibet named Yeshe-ur decided that Buddhism was in a sorry state and that he was going to bring it back from India. So Yeshe-ur's son crossed the Himalayas, went to the great Indian monastery of Nalanda, and acquired hundreds and hundreds of texts, brought them back to Tibet, where those texts were copied into this very form. What you're looking at right here is a direct Tibetan translation of a Sanskrit text. The letters that you see before you are in fact Tibetan script, but they were invented specifically to translate Sanskrit for the second time into Tibetan so that Buddhism could cross the mountains. Now, this text says a lot about Buddhist philosophy and practice if you were to expand it, but it also says something very important symbolically. Look at the letters and you'll see golden luminosity. If you look behind the letters, you'll see a dark indigo background. The golden script that you see here symbolizes the luminosity that all of us experience in our day-to-day lives, whereas the dark background symbolizes the emptiness into which everything dissolves after its time is done. Now, if you are able to take the luminosity and the emptiness and put them together, in Buddhist thought, that amounts to enlightenment. So, although there is a great deal of very interesting information here, there's something else as well, and that is a hieroglyph of what it might be like to be in the enlightened state. It's teachings just like this, followed properly, that lead from the ordinary state of suffering and anxiety into the fully integrated state of enlightenment or awakening. In the 13th century, the key world historical development is the rise of the Mongol Empire. Now, one of the things that is poorly understood about Vajrayana Buddhism is the absolutely crucial role that that tradition and its various lamas played in the conversion of the Mongols and subsequently the Chinese Yuan dynasty to certain forms of Tibetan Buddhism. This small bronze represents a gentleman named Karma Pakshi, and you can tell him by his red-black hat, and also you can tell that this is specifically Karma Pakshi by that neat little pointed beard that he has. He was a magnificent scholar, And his scholarship was aimed at one thing in particular, making the complex world of Vajrayana Buddhism understandable to the great Khan, Kublai Khan, which is exactly what he did. Karmapakshi was able to convince Kublai Khan that the right way to approach life and even to govern his empire was to do that through the medium of Vajrayana Buddhism. Karmapakshi is wearing a hat, and that hat is understood to be the magical, invisible hat of the order of Tibetan Buddhism, known as the Karma Kagyu. So, in Buddhist thought, if you've developed your perceptual abilities to a certain point, it is in fact possible to see this magical black hat above Karma Kagyu lamas even to this day, although the real material object, which I hear does exist, remains lost. The Tibetans have a whole set of very interesting technologies, you might call them, in order to render a lama, who might otherwise be deceased, present. And those procedures are called consecration. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about consecration and about one of our most important consecrated sculptures next. The relationship between Tibetan Buddhist masters and members of the Chinese imperial family was long-standing, and one of the most important of those figures who was involved with the Chinese imperial families is sitting right here next to me. This is a gentleman named Losang Palden-Yeshe. He lived in the 18th century and was a confidant of none other than the Qianlong Emperor of China. He is the 6th Panchen Lama. Now, I'm certain you've heard of the Dalai Lamas. The Panchen Lamas are their counterparts, and they alternate holding the throne in Tibet with the Dalai Lamas. This 6th Panchen Lama was especially important because he instructed the Qianlong Emperor in all kinds of aspects of Vajrayana philosophy. And in return, the Qianlong Emperor created all kinds of artworks, many wonderful bronzes, many wonderful paintings for Losang Palden-Yeshe, including this portrait of Losang Palden-Yeshe. If you take a close look at this gentleman, you can tell the very order of Himalayan Buddhism that he comes from. His hat is pointed, and it would be yellow. This identifies him as a member of the Gelug order of Himalayan Buddhism that was incredibly important in the 18th century in China. If you look at his right hand, you will see that he is holding it in the gesture of teaching. Originally, this would have held a lotus, and there are remnants of that here on this sculpture. His left hand is held in the posture of meditation. There are also some very interesting physical aspects to this sculpture that are invisible. Take a look at those 2 brocade cushions that he's sitting on. They are magnificently carved, there's no question about that, and it's a wonderful artwork. But there's something else even more powerful going on here. It's because if we were to open up these 2 cushions, what we would find inside is a collection of sacred syllables, a collection of mantras, a collection of sacred substances, all of which would have been deposited within this sculpture by a lama who consecrated the sculpture. How does that work? The lama visualizes the sacred figure descending into the sculpture and then seals that sacred figure into the sculpture at the brow, the throat, and the heart, so that the body, speech, and mind of Losang Palden-Yeshe could persist throughout time. In Tibetan Buddhist thought, this is the virtual presence of Losang Palden-Yeshe. So, if you interact with this object and the right frame of mind, you are not interacting with a bronze. You're interacting with Losang Palden-Yeshe. What a powerful concept. The very close relationship between the Qianlong Emperor of the Qing dynasty and Tibetan forms of Buddhist meditation and practice is perhaps most eloquently expressed in the absolutely incredible artistic output that the Qianlong Emperor generated from the imperial workshops. Now, what you're looking at right here is a Thangka painting that was created in those imperial workshops. Its mode of manufacture is absolutely superb. This is just about as good as it gets. It might look like it's a unique piece, and in fact, great care has been lavished on this object, and yet, we know from historical records that this is only one of 9,999 paintings that were made by the Qianlong Emperor on the occasion of his mother's 80th birthday. Why on earth would the Qianlong Emperor make copies of the red Buddha Amitayus for his mother's 80th birthday? Well, at least part of the answer lies in Amitayus's name. In Sanskrit, Amita means infinite, and Ayus is life. So Amitayus is infinite life. By creating a whole bunch of these images, what the Qianlong Emperor has done is not only help his mother have a longer life, which is part of what this figure is supposed to do, but he also helps his mother enter into a certain place called a pure land. That pure land is called Sukhavati, the land of bliss. And by making lots of objects like this and dedicating the merit, the good karma that comes from making them to the good rebirth of his mother, the Qianlong Emperor is able to help her get to her future destination. So, two functions right here in this one painting: long life and great death. But it's beautiful too. Let's take a quick look at Amitayus and see the magnificent gold work on his crown. Or, better yet, take a look at the vase that he's carrying in his two hands, because in fact, that's the vase of long life. And by representing that image again and again and again, Himalayan Buddhists understand that image as able to catalyze long life itself.
This money wall is effectively a great big Buddhist pantheon in one place. And in fact, this is the only one in the United States. It was donated by Richard Blum, the famous mountaineer and husband of Senator Dianne Feinstein. Now let me tell you a little bit about this wonderful money wall. It was created in Nepal and brought here by Mr. Blum's American Himalayan Foundation, and the pantheon itself consists of many fascinating figures. Here we have Milarepa, listening to his master's voice. And over here, the great Lama Tsongkhapa, who tamed the demons of eastern Tibet. Now, in other places as well, we have fantastic sigils. This sigil here is the all-powerful 10. It overcomes all negativities. In the Buddhist cosmos, there are many Buddhas, and that's because there are many problems that sentient beings have. And so, here we have the Buddhas of the three times: the past, the present, and the future, each one addressing the problems of sentient beings in those three times. But if there's one figure who's more important than anyone else in Tibet, it's this gentleman. It's Avalokiteshvara, and you can tell him by his hands clasped at the chest. In his right upper hand, he holds a mala, or meditation beads, and in his left upper hand, a lotus flower. It is this bodhisattva whose mantra you have probably heard before, Om Mani Padme Hum. It is understood to release sentient beings of whatever type from whatever suffering they may find themselves in. Now, here you have a wonderful mandala, a full mandala, of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. Here you see him touching the ground at the very moment of his enlightenment, with his two major disciples on either side. He's surrounded by Buddhas of the fortunate eon in which we find ourselves right now. Now here we have two famous religious figures that are in sexual union with their counterparts. This activity is understood to create the great bliss, or Mahasukha, which is equivalent to enlightenment in Buddhist thought. Now, in order for this to happen, sometimes, Buddhist adepts will interact with figures called dakinis. These are fierce female yoga adepts, and here is one of them, right there, with her foot raised in the dancing posture.
And over here, the great deity Green Tara, who releases everyone from the 8 great fears. What a perfect Vajrayana deity for our days and time.
Well, all right, everyone. We hope that you were very inspired by that video, and please, again, put questions into the Q&A so that we can ask our curator, Jeff, about them. Jeff, let's have you unmute so that we can get you to chat about them. Probably a good start.
It does.
I saw that you were answering some of the questions in the Q&A. But let's see, I had a question that I want to start out with, and please everyone put your questions into the Q&A as we go on. And in one of the first pieces, there was the skull container that held the negative emotions of humanity. How does that object relate to something that we normally have on view that's on loan right now, which is it's a water vessel or any kind of liquid vessel that's made out of human skulls? Is that sort of similar in theme, or is there a connection between those two pieces culturally?
That's a cool question. Yeah, there actually is a very close connection. As it turns out, that ewer that you're talking about consists of 2 human skulls that are put together like this. Now, what that ewer is used for is in initiatory ceremonies that the water that it contains will be poured over the head. And
that's interesting.
And that's what will effectively initiate a practitioner. Now, sometimes this procedure is also used in consecration, so there's an overlap between the two, but that skull ewer and your skull are connected in these practices.
Oh, that's really interesting. And unfortunately, that the object that I'm discussing is not currently on view, but it's definitely one of my favorites in the collection. I always really liked getting to see it. And let's see some of these questions. Let me look and find a good one. Let's see. And I might need some help with these pronunciations. Did the Huanglong Emperor choose 9,999 copies of the Amida Buddha because 9 is such a good luck number in Tibet, as opposed to the number 8 in China?
My suspicion is that there were a whole bunch of numerological considerations here. And I also suspect that the numerological considerations were both Tibetan and Chinese, and that these things were negotiated. We can't actually get at that, so it's a little bit speculative, but I would be very surprised if there were not intensive numerological discussions here.
And is Tantrum Buddhism, Himalayan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, do they have a lot of similarities, or what are some of the key differences?
This is one of the most complex questions in all Himalayan, Tibetan, Buddhist studies. The question of what Tantra is and the question of what the Vajrayana or lightning vehicle is, they overlap a lot. And the question of whether or not all Himalayan traditions fall into that bucket, that's an open question too. So I wish I could say more about that in the short span of time that we have. If we had about 3 hours, we could really have fun with this one.
We could probably scratch the surface.
Yes, and it's very complicated, and as you might expect, the term Tantra has certain semantic resonances that aren't entirely correct. And one of the first things we have to do is undo those, and then we can start talking.
And let's see. Oh, let's see. So there was some difference in the pronunciation of the Himalaya. I'm sort of used to saying Himalaya. And is that due to regional differences, or like what is the sort of pronunciation there?
Well, it's actually pretty simple in Sanskrit. Hima is snow, and alaya is a place or an abode. So Himalaya is the abode of snows, the land of snows, where it's really cold. Himalaya is how you would pronounce it if you were following the Sanskrit. But I, as someone who grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, said Himalaya for a long time. And I think that's probably what you'll hear most of the time, but Himalaya is the way to pronounce it if you're really interested in getting it just right.
And when Lang Dharma pushed Buddhism out of Tibet, what did he replace it with? And do we know how the people responded?
You know, when societies go through what historians sometimes call dark ages, the reason they call them dark ages is that there isn't a lot of information. And that's actually the problem that we have with this 100-year period between the decease of Padmasambhava and the rise of the second wave of Buddhism. A whole bunch of the record-keeping apparatus associated with the Tibetan kingdom fell away. So what we have to do is piece together information from surviving textual corpuses, surviving architecture, and so there's a whole bunch of guesswork involved there. So the short answer to that is we don't know a lot of what was going on. We do know that a large group of monks moved to eastern Tibet and kept the Vinaya, that is the monastic tradition, alive while all of this was going on in Lhasa and surrounding realms.
And this may fall under the kind of unknown category, but when we talk about the conversion of these people, we sort of speak about it in very broad terms because it happened so long ago. We're sort of able to really succinctly summarize these long events. Do we know like how long it might take for mass conversions to happen and like really be adopted by a culture? Would it be kind of abrupt, like maybe 10 years, or would it take hundreds of years? Do we know that?
It really differs depending on cultural context. What we know about the first Tibetan reception of Buddhism is that it happened very rapidly, but primarily at the elite levels of society. Now, the second wave of Buddhist penetration into Tibet, that occurred more at the grassroots level and involved a whole bunch of different adepts, rather than the link between Padmasambhava and the monarch at the time when it comes to the early or Nyingma transmission.
And there seems to be a very close relationship between life and death in many cultures, and something we all sort of struggle with. And the concept of longevity in life is very prominent in many cultures. And we have a question, how do Tibetans explain these two concepts?
Of long life, or?
It's just the close relationship between life and death.
The close relationship between life and death, I think all of us really understand that. To be born is to die. But the close relationship, if you can say the question one more time.
Just sort of how do Tibetans explain or represent the relationship between life and death and how close that relationship is?
I think that the short answer to that question is that this is explored everywhere in all the art. I hope that a number of you were able to come and see Awaken and perhaps see this wonderful trident that we borrowed from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And this wonderful object on the front has a skull, and on the back it has a phallus. So you have the human generative apparatus and what happens after we die on separate sides of the exact same object. And so when we had this in the museum, one of the things that I liked to do when we talked about it was to say that this illustrates very precisely the integrality of life and death in the Tibetan tradition.
And that kind of relates to another question we have, which is that reproductive imagery seems to be very prominent in some places. Is that similar to the intersection of both yin and yang?
It is both philosophical, and I think we can be fairly certain from what historical sources we have. It was not merely philosophical and symbolic, but probably, in fact, almost certainly, these kinds of things were part of practice at certain points in time. And if you've read enough of the literature, you'll see that this is in fact prescribed at certain points in time. But this only happens at the very highest reaches of the path.
And can you tell us, these are wonderful examples of beautiful pieces. where would they be? Would they be in the public? Would they be reserved for people's homes? Or how were they used in daily life?
So almost every Tibetan home will have an altar. Almost every Vajrayana practicing home will have an altar, and those will have bronzes and paintings. So the kinds of objects that we display and conserve at the Asian Art Museum, many of them would have had a home on a home altar. Other larger ones, such as our Ming Guhya Samaja, who will be back in a few months from the Reuben Museum, would have been in temples. So you can tell the likely place where these objects may have been simply through their size.
And
so, Pakshi, who's about this big, probably would have been a practice object for a student who would have carried that lama with them and established a connection to Karma Pakshi through that small sculpture, which would have been passed down to more students, which is probably how we got it.
And the coloring of these vibrant golds and reds seems to be very predominantly used. Is there like a reason behind that, or is it just that, I mean, I like it now, but we've painted our galleries that like really striking red. Is there a reason behind that?
Well, this is a very long-standing curatorial practice in Himalayan studies to bring in the, if we can say this, the atmosphere of a Tibetan / Himalayan environment through that particular color, which happens to be ubiquitous in certain contexts. Now, that's why that gallery looks that way. The color red in Himalayan art is something else and typically refers to the Western direction, which is the direction of the Buddha of infinite life, Amitayus, who we saw on that tanka. Now, gold is its own thing. Gold is a prime symbol for how can we put this? For the enlightened mind, which is present in all beings and stays the way it is, no matter how polluted it gets. It's always golden. Now, why is gold such a super metaphor for that? Because no matter what you do with gold, it stays gold. So no matter what happens to your ultimate mind, it stays ultimate mind.
And kind of on the subject of the ultimate mind, if I can sort of weave these together, we saw that there was sort of a spiritual advisor to these leaders of these countries. What would their roles be? We have a question asking if you can talk about the relationship between these teachers and the kings that they taught and advised, because there were a lot of non-violent teachings of the Buddha, which seems to go directly against the violence of war and sort of the inherent nature of political gain. So can you sort of discuss that a little bit?
The issue of violence?
Or just how were these figures advising? Were they spiritual advisors, or were the political qualities deeply intertwined?
Yes. So I can give you a very clear example. There was a guy named Pekpa who was an advisor to the Mongol Khans, and we have texts that Pekpa presented to the Mongol Khans that are hardcore Vajrayana practice texts. So the guy was practicing. At the same time, Vajrayana adepts, we have historical sources that attest to this too, would have promised political figures military advantages. Why? Because if you are on the side of Dharma and there are obstacles to the Dharma, obviously the traditional figures are going to help you overcome those obstacles. So we have, on the one hand, records of actual religious practice being communicated, and on the other hand, promises of worldly or political or military victory. So I think the short answer to the question here is yes, you've got both sides of the spectrum here.
And those actions that happened definitely have had lasting impacts on modern life for quite a few people. But we have this other question that I think is really interesting. Is the script that we saw in the video, is that something, I mean, obviously I can't read it, but is that something that is still used today for the text? Is it sort of the same language, or has it evolved at all?
It's the same script, but it is as if, let me think of a good example here. It's as if you were reading an Old English text in a regular Roman script. You would be able to sound out the words, but it would be a little bit obscure. So modern Tibetan is written in those same letters as the ancient is, but the ancient would read like Old English does to us.
Which would be a little bit difficult.
Yeah.
And we have a question about the karma kagyu, ooh, my pronunciations, the invisible hat. Sort of a clarifying question. Would that be something that people who had not yet reached enlightenment could see on people who had reached enlightenment? So if someone reached enlightenment, would it appear above their head? Or was it something that those who had reached enlightenment could see on other people?
Yeah, here's the idea. It's if your meditations and self-development have reached a certain level and your perceptual faculties have been refined to a certain point, then things that would otherwise be invisible, like this subtle magical black hat, then become visible to you. So it's through the force of meditation and yoga practice that otherwise invisible subtle objects become visible, with this hat being one of those. Now, whether or not we're dealing with what we call history or what we call legendary history, that remains open to question.
And you mentioned that the real material object was lost. To clarify, does this mean that people would wear them like sort of symbolically to show that they had reached enlightenment? What does that mean that they've been lost?
There was an original, as far as we know. There was an original black hat that Karma Pakshi wore. It was kept for a while and then disappeared. Now, if you look at Karma Kagyu lamas, you will often see them wearing facsimiles of this black hat. So in that case, it's clearly symbolic, but there is a story out there that there was an original. I don't know, but it's quite intriguing.
Maybe back to the first question of the chat, if we could go back in time, that would be nice to see what happened to that.
Yes.
And we have a question. This is more about a collection piece specifically. Does the museum have many Bon pieces, B-O-N?
Two. We have two Bön pieces, and Bön is the pre-Buddhist, indigenous, and I'm going to put air quotes around this, shamanic tradition of Tibet. However, once we start getting Bön art, like we have in the museum, those two incredible 13th century objects, the cool part about it is that the Bön artists are using Buddhist models. So you will find things like the mark of a Bön adept is a swastika. So you will find Avalokiteshvara, the great Buddha, the great Bodhisattva, excuse me. It looks like Avalokiteshvara, but instead of a lotus, you've got a swastika. So you know that this is from the Bön tradition, the pre-Buddhist shamanic substrate.
And do we have any plans of doing an exhibition around them anytime soon?
Well, it's not around these figures, but I think it's really important, and this is not something that we've touched on. We have often dealt with world traditions and the art and their art output at the Asian Art Museum. What we would like to do as one of our many projects going forward is explore what some of the indigenous traditions were doing with their artwork before the world traditions came on the scene, or in cooperation with those world traditions. Right now, Mongolian contemporary art is doing some really amazing, jaw-dropping stuff with exactly this concept.
And can you discuss the materials used in the painting? And can you explain how they were displayed or stored?
So the materials are all mineral pigments. So you see a blue and that's lapis, you see green and that's malachite, you see red and that's cinnabar. Where these objects would have been stored is if they are really, really secret stuff, If it's really, really secret stuff, it would have been stored in a secret chamber called the gongkang, and typically you'll find black thangkas there. Otherwise, there will be storehouses, or some monasteries and gompas, practice centers, will store, if you want to put it that way, thangkas all along the sides of the practice room.
And what would make them be, what qualities would they have to make them secret and sort of need to be protected?
Well, if you go into the Himalayan galleries, you're going to see certain figures that it will be intuitively obvious why they might be secret. And typically these figures will either be involved in violent or sexual activities.
So were those types of that imagery wasn't very widely accepted as being imagery that people would want to see?
No, it's fine to see it. It's that if you want to practice that imagery in a really intensive kind of way, that's advanced stuff. This is like trying to play free jazz when you don't know how to play the C major scale. So the really esoteric stuff needs to be kept from the student until they have developed to this point where they can handle it.
And who would make these objects? Are they ever signed by noteworthy artists that are, or were they created like for learning, and like the paintings probably took a different hand clearly than the sculptures. So what are sort of, who would make these?
I'm going to answer your first question first.
Okay.
Typically, Tibetan artists will not sign their works. These are supposed to be anonymous works. And here I'm talking specifically about paintings. However, we have an object in our collection. I'll give you the accession number. It's B60D38+. And this is an image of a lama named Böten Rinchen Drup. He was a 14th century lama from Shalu Monastery. It's a great painting, but the guy who painted it, we know his name because he signed the painting. And this is the only painting in the entire corpus of Tibetan paintings that I know of that has been signed by an author, in contradistinction to what I understand as basic principles of Buddhist art practice.
And that's amazing. So we're very lucky to be able to see that.
This is the same painting. And some of y'all who are listening out there may have seen it. I've shown it a couple of times over the past decade. This is the same painting that if you turn it over onto the back, you will see the handprints of the Lama who consecrated it, along with 3 different consecration scripts that you can use to, if you're a geek like me, that you can use to understand all 3 of those scripts. That's why I call this painting the Rosetta Stone of Tibetan painting, and we have it at the Asian Art Museum.
And how do we know whether an object has been consecrated or not, since it's sort of within the object in theory? So how are we able to know that?
We know for sure because, well, there's a couple of things. If you're talking about a bronze, if you turn that bronze over underneath, and I wish I've got some in here, but I can't reach one real fast. If you turn them over, you will see on the underside a crossed vajra. And what that indicates is that has been sealed. So if you know anything about ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptian priests would seal tombs with their 9 jackal seal, and that means that tomb has been consecrated and it's closed. Well, in the Buddhist context, when you look at the bottom of a sculpture and you see that those crossed vajras, that means that it has been closed and sealed and the sacred is contained inside of it. That's one way we can tell with bronzes. Now with paintings, we have to turn those paintings around. And when we turn those paintings around and we see behind the main figure an Om right here, an Ah right here, and a Hum right here, those are traces of the ritual activity that transformed the painting from just a bunch of colors into a sacred presence.
And I know that we, I forget her name. She's on one foot. I believe she's on loan. But there was there were seeds, like a pouch inside of her. Is it common for museums to expect there to be hidden objects within other objects? Is that something that museums do, like X-ray, or like expect to look inside of objects?
That is a very important and a loaded question for sure, because what is it that we're doing if we open one of these consecrated objects? If I or the if I or the conservation department opens one of these objects, what are we effectively doing? To my mind, if that object is not already open, we are despoiling a deposition. So if an object is sealed, my presumption is that it is consecrated and I will not open it. Now, with respect to the sculpture you're talking about, which is Simhavakra Dakini, she's back up in the galleries now, yay. She had in her muzzle, she's a dancer with a lion head, and she had in her muzzle a consecration deposit that we didn't know was there until about 6 years ago. She's got a hole on her back, so we assumed it had been rifled in antiquity or 300 years ago or so. But no, X-rays revealed that that deposit was still intact, and we have since resealed it. She is still a sacred figure.
I wonder if that makes the conservationists their skin crawl a little bit, knowing that there could be something inside of the object.
Yeah, but you know, it does. And in this case, though, I think that the cultural integrity of the object is the key thing we need to focus on. And having that consecration deposit in there is what provides that cultural integrity.
And I think we only have time for one final question. So I would like to close it out by asking you, what is your favorite piece at the Asian Art Museum? What really brings you joy and delights you every time you get to see it?
Well, there's so many. I mean, how am I supposed to pick one?
I know, wait for me to end it on a very loaded question.
I'd say that my very favorite object that we have is the object that I mentioned, which is B60D38 plus. That's the Lama Bhutan Chendrup, which is the Rosetta Stone of Himalayan Buddhism. If you are interested in understanding how their art works and how the best art is made, that is the magic key.
Well, we're going to have to take a tour sometime. I hope you guys can come whenever you can, since things are opening back up. We would be so excited to have you back at the museum. We're so happy to be able to do this program today. And thank you, Jeff, for being here to answer all these questions. Thank you to our team, our behind the scenes team of John and everyone who worked to make this possible. I really enjoyed that video. I had such a great time getting to chat with you. And really thank you to all of our attendees. You guys are the ones who make this possible. We are so happy that we can offer this program for everyone. And if you're interested in the next installment of the Art Escapes program, we will be talking about prestige and protection in Indonesian art. And that is on Saturday, the 19th. So we hope that you will get a chance to come to our museum sometime. But if you're still, if you're in a different state or a little bit farther away from us, we hope that you can still enjoy all of the virtual programming. And we hope that these programs have been able to bring us together in a sense. I know that it's definitely given me a stronger connection to the exhibits, and I always really look forward to them. So again, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes. And we hope to see you at the next Art Escapes. And goodbye, everyone.